Welcome to session 5 of the Habitech Insider Podcast. I'm Charles Redgrave Plum here at Habitech, and today we're talking about breaking the gigabit barrier and the evolution of broadband into homes and businesses and how this affects you as the integrator. To help us get into this topic, today I'm joined by Justin Martin Lawrence, our technical manager, and Scott Spence, who is our network support specialist for the South. So Scott, for those that don't know you, would you mind giving us a bit of a background to yourself and where you came from before you joined Habitech?
Yeah, sure. So I was started in 1996 for a company called Gibson Music. They're an integrated company. During my time there, I'd done Crestron training and Lutron training. My Lutron training, in fact, was actually done over in New York because there wasn't any Lutron offices over in the UK. So I was there for 11 years, and then I started at Clark Infinity, where I was there for 17 years, and I was doing Crestron, Lutron, RTI, Control 4, all of the networks, so building the networks, programming, fault finding, servicing and maintenance while I was there. Great,
and that's really why we wanted you involved today, because we wanted it not just to be the Habitech show of Justin and I talking about our view of the world, and we really wanted to bring someone in with installer experience. Unfortunately, there was a customer who couldn't be here today to join us, but I think it's really important we can bring in some installer perspective on these things, so it's not just us giving our view on the world. In 2018, the UK government introduced Project Gigabit, and this was an ambitious plan to bring gigabit speeds to the whole of the UK by 2025. Gigabit broadband is already here. Some of us have it in our homes. Justin, I know you're running just over a gig in Edenbridge in Kent with Virgin Media. I've got fibre to the property in my premises in the middle of nowhere. So it's not just in the cities that fibre to the property is happening. It's here, and it's here to stay, and it's only going to get faster. So let's talk a little bit about the plan to roll out fibre to the property through the various different providers, whether that's Openreach or Virgin Media O2. And I think this is in line with Openreach's plan to turn off their existing copper infrastructure by 2025. So what are the challenges that this rollout is going to propose to our integrators?
Well, the main one is really the bandwidth of the equipment that integrators are putting in. This change is such a sea change in the industry that the plan of switching copper off by the end of 25 means that having a full fibre infrastructure is pretty much future-proof. I mean, as we know, bandwidth is restricted in copper, but far less so with glass. Obviously, there are upper limits. But there's no reason now that gigabit broadband is here that won't increase, and this is exactly what we're seeing from the ISPs.
Fine, okay. And Scott, when you were deploying networks, I mean, how many of the properties that you were going to visit, how many of them had this issue of they want really fast broadband, they pay for really fast broadband, they do the speed test on their phone, and they go, Scott, I'm paying for a gig, I'm only getting 400 meg here. What's going on? Why am I not getting what I'm paying for?
I think every customer that has some level of installation and they're expecting that speed, and rightly so, they're relying on that speed as well, because the way the world has changed over the last few years, where there's more people working from home, schooling from home, running businesses from home, having them do the speed test, that they're expecting to reach those speeds.
So with the rollout of fibre to the premises, let's talk about some of the technology that ISPs are using to get these ultra-fast speeds into our homes. So the acronym at the moment that's flying around is GPON or GPON. So Justin, would you mind just giving us a brief condensed run through on GPON, if you can, because I know it's quite a wide and broad subject.
I'll try and condense it. Well, the simple story is that through evolution, we've ended up with a situation where we've got what's known as fibre to the cabinet, which is where broadband is delivered over fibre from the exchange to the local cabinet or the street cabinet. And then that's converted to copper in a thing called a DSLAM, and then uses the existing copper wires into the home. So with the government initiative to get everything gigabit by 2025, how can ISPs get there? Well, probably the easiest way is to consider, if you've already got fibre going to the cabinet, how can you make a very easily deployable fibre solution to the home? And that is GPON. So where GPON is somewhat unique in how networking fibre works is the P stands for passive. So it's gigabit passive optical networking. And the passive bit is that in the cabinet, the device in the cabinet, the OLT, is the only device that actually produces light. So it's very, very easy to deploy, because actually what happens is you can run a combined plastic and glass fibre, which is more rigid than conventional fibre, to an underground duct or to a telegraph pole. And then you have passive splitters, which are literally glass prisms in the street duct or at the telegraph pole, which split those fibres out to the home. And that means that the fibre can very easily replace or supplement an existing copper cable into the home with very, very little interference or specialist equipment.
Okay, so it sounds like in essence, it's a cheap, retrofittable way. When I say cheap, I mean in the grand scheme of things, cheap from an engineering cost point of view, to be able to upgrade the existing network in a sensible and quick fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's simply a question of opening the street cabinet, replacing the DSLAM with a device called an OLT, which is basically an expensive fibre switch. And then that has several optical outlets, which then go to the various street poles or street ducts.
And this is your box of mirrors?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. So we've spoken about GPON, which is obviously going through BT Openreach's infrastructure. And for those that aren't on Openreach or using one of the new fibre companies like GigaClear, Swish Fibre, Truly, there's a lot of customers out there that are using Virgin Media O2's network. So what are some of the significant changes that are going to be rolling out on Virgin Media's network?
Well, Virgin Media started out using a coax system which they inherited from previous cable providers, and that to a great extent has been how it's been until recently. And they're moving to a hybrid platform, which they term as HFX, so hybrid fibre coax. And that initially has started with the upgrade of the coaxial cable that they use to DOCSIS 3.1, which technically means that each coax can actually deliver 10 gigabits per second. So for the last, year and a bit, Virgin Media have already been delivering what they call a Gig 1 service over that DOCSIS network. And that Gig 1 actually delivers more than a gig. It actually delivers 1,140 megabits per second. So it exceeds the gigabit barrier. And the intention is to increase that. So even with the DOCSIS networks, Virgin Media have now launched Gig 2, the Gig 2 platform, 2 gigabits per second and above, slightly over 2 gigs actually. And then towards 2028, so between now and 2028, they're going to be replacing the existing coax regional networks with fibre, and then at the premises converting that fibre back into coax, so that it's backward compatible with their existing products.
So in essence, what we're saying is there are fibres that go into a splitter box, and then from there are distributed to the various properties on a street. Yeah?
Yes.
So how do we, if we're sharing fibre between properties, how do we keep the traffic on those fibres secure? If 1, 2, 3, 4 houses are sharing the same fibre, as an example, what stops house 1 from seeing house 2's traffic and so on?
Well, there are two answers to that question, because the first one is also bandwidth. So presently, with GPON, the G being gigabit, the fibre can only actually carry 2.5 gigabits downstream and 1.25 gigs up. So if people are buying a 900 service, obviously you can't split that stream too many times. So what happens is there are multiple fibres that go out, and they can go into either 4, 8, 12 or 32-way splitters. So generally speaking, you would see a 4 and 8 being deployed. And then of course you've got the question of, well, how can that data not be shared by the devices? And that's the clever thing. So at the OLT, the device in the cabinet, the data is encrypted. And then at the ONT, the little device that's on the wall in the customer's premises, the ONT actually makes an encryption agreement with the OLT, so that although every house is getting the same amount of light data, only the data prescribed for the subscriber ends up in their premises.
Yeah, so it's the lock and key.
Yeah, it's encryption.
Your neighbour doesn't have the key to unlock your traffic.
Exactly that.
In
Yeah,
essence.
it's exactly the same way it's been done with cable for years.
Sure. Okay. So the other part of that is with fibre, you get traffic or you don't get traffic. So how do the ISPs control what speed you're on? For example, I have fibre straight in. I know if I wanted to, I could spend fortune on 900 meg broadband, but I don't need that. It's only myself and Sophie in the house, so we have 500 meg. That's absolutely fine. What is limiting my speed down? How do they do that?
That's very clever. So the first thing, the physical thing, is actually how many times that 2.5 gig is split. So that's down to the amount of splitters that you use or the amount of split outs you use. The other thing is actually traffic shaping, because obviously if you think about it, there has to be a way where if Mr. Jones doesn't pay his bill but Mrs. Smith does, how do you stop data going into Mr. Jones's house? And the simple thing is traffic shaping. So what happens is the amount of broadband data that is received in a premises is actually shaped according to the plan they're on at the head end.
Fine, cool. And as I said at the start, my example is rural housing estate where there's a handful of houses, but in city environments where we are now contending with large MDUs, a far higher density of populace, how are they ensuring that everyone can get those speeds? Because it's a different application sharing gigabit broadband to a block of 100 flats than it is to a little rural road in the countryside with 10 houses.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of things. First of all, the amount of data going into the cabinet itself, the local cabinet to the premises, needs to be enough to supply those residents. And that will be done through either multiple fibres or traffic shaping. There are various techniques for that. And in fact, you mentioned MDUs. In many ways, GPON is a much easier way to deliver to MDUs because the splitter mechanism means that you can mount a splitter on one MDU and then split it out to various premises. You might, according to the speed that the customer subscribes to, choose to put multiple splitters and therefore make sure there's enough data going through. But also the thing, which I think we're probably going to come on to, is the fact that fibre, to a great extent, has a very, very high ceiling of bandwidth, and GPON is really just the beginning. There are already speed increases coming through XGPON and 25 GPON, which will enable one fibre to carry significantly more and therefore provide more to the customers.
And this is part of Habitech's messaging, certainly on the ProNet side of things. And for those that don't know ProNet is our I suppose, umbrella name for all things networking, whether that's training, our product portfolio, and everything in between. So our messaging for ProNet has been 10 gig end-to-end networking for certainly the last sort of 2-3 years. But it seems now that the ISPs are finally starting to catch up in a bigger way. So what is it about the products that we're installing right now? Let's take out multi-gig, take out 10 gig. Let's talk about gigabit, because at the moment we're talking about gigabit speeds coming in and gigabit networks. So what is it about the products right now that aren't sufficient even for a gigabit network?
Well, the thing you need to consider with what we term as gigabit is, in reality, in networking devices, it isn't 1,000 megabits per second, simply because there is an overhead. So the way network traffic is organised is it's split into packets and frames. And the overhead of organising those frames, just the basic Ethernet frames, means that you get a reduction in speed down to about maybe 970 megabits per second. When you add in things like TCP/IP overhead, which is where you have source and destination information in TCP packets and the size of the frames that they reside in, that actually decreases down to 930 on a good day, on a perfect day. Then you've got the complication that you've got multiple devices on your network and you've got the broadband coming in. So you could say, well, okay, I've got, let's say, 930 megs coming into my property being distributed on my gigabit system. That's just the broadband. That doesn't include any of the data that's going between devices. So when a device needs to contact another device, it might send a broadcast. When a broadcast sent, network traffic has to stop. So the more devices you have on your network, the slower that network's going to run. And then you've got to consider well, am I sending audio? Am I sending video? Am I airplaying, Chromecasting, all of those things which require bandwidth? You're very quickly going to exceed the bandwidth, the combined bandwidth that you've got, not only with broadband, but with the devices on the network. So what's going to happen? Well, basically, stuff's going to get queued, data's going to get lost, the network becomes inefficient. The cap of the network has to exceed the incoming broadband quite significantly.
So, and I think probably a good analogy for this is a bit like in commercial world when we're designing audio systems across 100 volt, 70 volt line amplifiers, is we always allow more headroom than the system's gonna pull, right? We're never maximizing it.
Absolutely.
Never running at 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you get that client or that end user, where they are paying for a service, whether it's 900 meg, 500 meg, whatever that speed is, and when they go to their device, laptop, phone, tablet, and do a speed test, they're not getting for what they're paying for from the ISP, and it's a result of the equipment within the property is the bottleneck.
Yep.
In your experience, how do you educate the client on that to get them to upgrade it?
So one of my previous customers had normal broadband coming into their property, and they'd actually paid for their own personal fibre being pulled across fields into the property to then be able to get a gig broadband up and down. However, because of the age of their installation, their Wi-Fi access points were Wi-Fi 5, they wasn't Wi-Fi 6. Their network switches were only a gig switch, even the fibre link ports were only for a gig. And so the easiest way to do it was just take some new kit to site, say I'll install it, and I can guarantee we'll get the speeds that you're looking for. So changing a couple of network switches, putting a couple of nice ruckus access points in, Wi-Fi 6 access points, they go from getting like 200-300 meg up to like 600, and they see the massive improvement. And once you've done that, they go, yep, do it all. So
fine. So in that experience, roughly how old was that client's installation, if you had to guess?
Probably 7 years.
Right. So did you find that the client was open to the idea of upgrading, or it was a no, I've paid a lot for this in the past, this will be fine?
At that time, because of how the world had gone, where people were working at home, they had people, their families, kids at school, schooling from home as well. It was kind of essential, so they just wanted it working.
Right.
And then once you could prove it was working, they were happy to just go with it.
I think it's quite interesting that you almost had to take equipment to the site on a whim that, when they see it working, they'll buy it.
Yeah.
But prior to you doing that, he didn't say, I know I need to upgrade this, or she, of course. But you know what I mean? You have to go to site with kit, install it, ahead of them agreeing to buy it, to prove that it would work.
Yeah, I think because in their previously they've already paid for a system, and then they've then got a faster broadband in, and they want to get those speeds that they're being delivered. But with their current kit that they've paid for a while ago, they were a bit reluctant. But once you can prove it, it was easy to do.
Cool.
I think the headline here is that is the jump in speed. So people are familiar with, if they're lucky, 60, 70 megabits per second, and now it's not jumping to 200, it's jumping to a gig. It's a massive change. Everything has to change to be able to provide that broadband throughout the premises.
Well, your home is quite a good example of this. So you said you were getting 1.1 gig in from Virgin Media.
Yeah.
And obviously as technical manager for us, you get all sorts of networking kit you have to put through its paces and try and break. That's the definition of your job for us. So the equipment you have in your house, is that multi-gig? And if it's not, it's all gigabit equipment. Your 1.1 you've got coming in, what's the result from your AP?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting actually, because that's exactly the conundrum I'm in. I've got a house that I wired 17 years ago or 18 years ago when we moved in for Gigabit, thinking that was the future. And now I'm faced with exactly this. And indeed, if you take the Virgin Media Gig 1 service, which is 1.14 gigs, actually to be able to get that service distributed through a network, you actually have to do, it's not complicated, so we're doing a video on it, but you actually have to do a load balanced algorithm from the Super Hub, which you have to use because it's their product, into your routing product and switching products. In fact, what's interesting is that Virgin Media have already prepared for this. So if you now buy a Virgin Media Gig 1 or above service, that actually provides you with a Super Hub 5, and that has a multi-gig port on it. So that, and we're seeing exactly the same coming out of OpenReach. So that is the point where actually any router that's using 1 gig ports is going to become, old history, because without doing clever stuff, you can't get that bandwidth through.
And I think it's interesting. Obviously, the ISPs are having to upgrade the free of charge kit they give to their customers to ensure they can get these speeds. But it's really interesting. We went through that period of time where everyone went poo-poo and bashed the ISP free router. No, you don't want that. It's rubbish. It won't work. Yet you're saying there that Virgin Media are giving out routers with 2.5 gig ports on it. There are plenty of CI, custom install focused networking brands who still don't have network routing products that have more than a gigabit port on them.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's worse than that because there are an awful lot of products out there. This is one of my personal beefs. An awful lot of gigabit networking products out there that can't actually pass a gigabit. They might have a gigabit port, but the CPU and firewall capabilities in that device are nowhere near it. And that's where they're going to start seeing complaints from customers, especially as you start to introduce Wi-Fi 6, 6E and 7, which are actually capable of delivering those speeds over Wi-Fi as well as wired connections. People tend to test Wi-Fi more than they test wired connections. That's going to become a problem. And in fact, there is another change. So when you take things like GPON, BT OpenReach don't necessarily have to provide a router. Well, I say BT OpenReach, they obviously have the infrastructure for the majority of ISPs that use GPON in the UK. So whichever ISP you use, they don't actually have to provide you with a router anymore because it is actually the ONT, the device on the wall that has the fibre from the street, that has an RJ45 output. It's up to you what you connect that to. And actually, when you look around our industry, as far as I can see, the only companies that even have multi-gig or gig plus capable products, or even gigabit routers that can actually do a gigabit, is Habitech.
Whilst we can say, the products we sell are capable of delivering gigabit, what is it that integrators should specifically be looking for on these networking products? Because I know it's a far and wide topic. So what is it specifically they should be looking for in terms of routing products? So maybe it's firewall throughput. On switches, maybe it's switching capacity. Would you mind just delving into that a little bit?
Sure. The big one is routers, or routers and security products, because another thing is that security products are becoming more and more fashionable or trendy because there are more security risks out there. Let's start with conventional routing equipment. So the easy way you can tell is when you look at a manufacturer, and that's with a UTM or a router. Any decent manufacturer will not just tell you that the ports are a gig or multi-gig. They will actually give you the firewall throughput. And you'll find that with every product that we sell. A lot of companies, when you actually start to read the small print, might say we have a gigabit LAN port, but when you do speed tests, you might see them lower than expected, and then put some bluster as to why that might be, which for me is clear implication that the product's not up to its worth. When you come out of the router, that becomes slightly more complicated because you need to consider things like the balance of bandwidth. So it's all very well saying I've got a gig, but in reality, it's not like the old days where you have one device wired to the internet. There are multiple devices in the home, so you need to make sure you can distribute that amount of bandwidth evenly and successfully amongst the devices you're using. So I would always say, beyond the routing or security equipment, you then need to be using a high capacity switch which at the very least has 10 gig uplinks, so you've got plenty of overhead, so that you can connect multi-gig capable access points at the core and distribute that speed evenly across the house. And between switches, always have at the very least multi-gig, but really 10 gig links between the switches, so that bandwidth is not being bottlenecked as it goes through.
Okay, so I think in a nutshell, really what we're saying is, regardless of the manufacturer, whether it's a Habitech product or not, look at the spec sheet. If it's generic, no detailed information, probably avoid that product.
Yep.
If the manufacturer is being true and honest and is providing the exact specifications of what it can and can't do, then that's probably a product that will fit the bill for gigabit network, or gigabit plus networking.
Yeah, gigabit plus, absolutely.
Scott, you've joined Habitech late November 2022, right?
Yep.
You joined us. For those that don't know you, obviously we've had a brief background on what you did at the start of this podcast, but what's your role within Habitech now in terms of network specification and design? Because all of what we've talked about today is good planning, the right products. So I think it's crucial to let integrators know what you do day to day for us and how you can help them on their projects.
So what I'll do is I'll design you a network. That's from the switches. I will also produce you Wi-Fi heat mapping using our heat mapping software. I'll also take into account PoE budget on the project as well.
Okay.
So Wi-Fi 6E access points, whether you've got touch panels and CCTV cameras, take all that into account on the Wi-Fi budget as well, and design you a system. And if you've got HD distribution that you need to do, we'll also produce the schematics and the design and the quote for the HD distribution, whether it's HD base T or AV over IP.
Okay. And we'll put a link, I think, to the example document on down below in the description as well, so people can see an example of what that looks like. Yeah. Some of the feedback I've had from other integrators that I've shown that to is great. Obviously, they're not going to put the Habitech branded version into their proposal, but they've taken screenshots of the important bits like your network health, the green heat map, into their own proposal, and they've submitted that to the client. So even if you're competent and happy with your network design and knowledge, sometimes just having a second set of eyes to look over that proposal and go, yep, I can't foresee any problems with that. Yep. It could just save you hassle on site, and it's a free service.
Absolutely. What we're trying to do is foresee any problems that you might get on site before you actually get to site. So there's nothing worse on a Friday afternoon that you turn up and you're trying to complete because everyone wants to go home, and you haven't got enough switch ports on a switch, or there isn't enough links to another switch. We're trying to foresee any problems that you get on site before you actually get to site, because there's nothing worse than being on site on a Friday afternoon and then coming up against an issue where you haven't got enough PoE ports or enough switch ports. And we're also thinking about the Cat6A cabling to access points rather than just normal Cat6, because of future proofing for 2.5 gig access points.
Brilliant. Okay, great. And I think also you're here with us today, but there is also Alex, yep, who's up in the north as well. So we have Scott down here in the south. He looks after all of the integrators down here. And we do have Alex ex-Wirestorm up in the north as well. So obviously he knows Wirestorm back to back. Obviously he knows Wirestorm like the back of his hand, but he's also really competent on the rest of our product portfolio as well. So if you're up in the north of the UK, use Alex. He is your resource. And if you're in the south of the UK, you have Scott as a resource. Contact your account manager if you need their contact details. They'd be more than happy to introduce you. And like I say, it's a free service. I think it's a no-brainer. Even if you don't use the proposal document, just to have that, like I say, that sanity check, I think is an invaluable service. So just before we wrap up, the other thing I'd like to very briefly talk about is the reshaping of our training, and really just taking on board feedback we've had from you guys as our integrators, was that everyone's demanding training, yet our in-person attendance seems to have dropped. It's not it's not that no one's coming. It's just that people are saying, I really, really want training. Everyone's screaming for training. We've put together a really, I think, quite a wide, comprehensive list of training courses, but the in-person attendance figures just aren't matching up to the demand we're getting. So as part of that process, with our new videographer, Dom, who's currently behind the scenes here, and he's looking at me with a nice big smile on his face, we're taking those modules and we're breaking them down into videos. So over the next few weeks and months, you'll see modular training videos popping up on various different topics. They'll be starting with networking. We might be moving into commercial AV, describing Dante, how it can be implemented and the benefits to it. So if you aren't already subscribed to us on YouTube, some of you will be watching this on YouTube, some of you will be listening on Apple Music or Spotify, please, please, please go to our YouTube channel. It's really simple. Just search Habitech. It should pop up right at the top of the list. Subscribe to us there, and that will be the hub of all the new video content that's coming out. Dom is really, really good at producing high quality video case studies. There will be training videos coming out. There's going to be product run-throughs. And also, this is a good opportunity, is if you have any feedback for us on topics you guys want to know about, tell us and we can do videos on it. It's not a problem. We're happy to do so. The more feedback you give us, the more we can tailor the content for you as our integrators and our customers. We're gonna give you our view of the world and what we think's right. But ultimately, if you don't find the content valuable, we're all wasting time. So please give us feedback. It's a bit like the CEDIA survey that everyone talks about, but no one does. They want your feedback. Please give us your feedback. Without it, we might be wasting our time. So I think that's pretty much it for this session. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Justin, for joining us. And yeah, see you in the next one.